He went into the dealership with a simple dream, to buy a car. But nobody took him seriously. The next day, he came back, and no one could have predicted what he would do. This is the story that will leave you speechless. How many times have you been judged on your appearance or age? Imagine being treated as if you weren't important, as if your presence were invisible. This is the story of an elderly man who proved that you should never underestimate anyone. What he did shocked everyone, and left a lesson that no one will ever forget. It was a sunny morning when João, a 72-year-old man, decided it was time to fulfill an old dream. After a lifetime of hard work as a carpenter, he had always put his family's needs before his own. Married for more than 5 decades, he and his late wife shared the desire to one day drive through the mountains in a car that was more than just functional, something that symbolized the fulfillment of a lifetime of sacrifice. Now widowed and with his children already raised, he decided it was time to give himself that gift. John was not an extravagant man. He still lived in the same modest house he had built with his own hands. His clothes were simple, nothing more than worn-out pants and a clean shirt, but faded by time. He believed that what counted was character, not appearance. That day, however, he would discover that not everyone thinks like that. As he entered the dealership, João was excited. He felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. The dealership was large, with shiny marble floors and new cars that glistened under the showroom lights. He walked calmly among the vehicles, observing every detail, like a boy in a toy store. But within the first few minutes, something disconcerted him. He noticed that the salespeople, all well-dressed in impeccable suits, barely looked at him. Instead, they seemed to be more interested in chatting among themselves or serving younger, well-dressed customers. João tried to ignore this. Perhaps they were busy. He decided to approach one of the cars to take a closer look. As he looked inside an elegant sedan, he heard discreet giggles coming from a corner. 2 salesmen were talking in low voices, but João could hear them clearly. Stuffy old man. He's probably just here to pass the time. João felt his face burn. He pretended not to hear and walked over to the table of a vendor who seemed less busy. With a shy smile, he asked, "Excuse me, could you help me? I'm interested in this model here." The salesman looked at him quickly, almost impatiently, and replied with an indifferent tone, "The price of that car is high, sir. Perhaps you'd like to look at the more basic models in the corner." John blinked, surprised at the rudeness. He tried to explain that he was willing to pay cash, but the salesman, without even getting up from his chair, said, "Yes, of course. Well, if you change your mind, let me know." It was as if a bucket of cold water had been thrown over him. John felt humiliated, but decided to give it another go. He went to another salesman, who was showing a car to a young couple. He waited patiently until the conversation was over, but when he tried to get the clerk's attention, he only received a quick glance and a dry reply. "I'll be right back with you, sir." João stood there, alone, for more than 20 minutes. The looks he received were not of respect, but of disdain. He heard more jokes in the background. Maybe he thinks they'll give him a discount for charity. Each word seemed to weigh more than the last. John was not a rich man, but he was a dignified one. He had spent his life treating people with respect, teaching his children never to judge anyone. Now, standing there, he felt that all the effort he had put into being a good example had been ignored. After almost an hour of being ignored and ridiculed, João left the dealership. His heart was heavy, but he didn't let the tears come. He walked slowly to his old truck, sat behind the wheel and stayed there for a few minutes, staring at the steering wheel. He thought of his wife, Maria, and the lessons they had always shared, No one is better than anyone else. Treat others as you would like to be treated. He sighed deeply, started the car and drove home. But along the way, a thought began to take shape in his mind. He knew he had the resources to do something about it. And for the first time that day, he felt a new emotion emerge: determination. That evening, João opened his old notebook where he kept notes on investments made over the years. He reviewed the figures and confirmed what he already knew. He had more than enough to change the situation. He decided that no one anywhere should be treated the way he was treated that day. This wasn't a battle for a car. It was a battle for respect. The next morning, João woke up before sunrise. Coffee was steaming on the kitchen table as he reviewed one last time the papers and documents that confirmed his position as majority investor in one of the largest car dealership chains in the region. That evening, he had discovered a detail that would change everything. The store where he had been humiliated was part of a conglomerate that he owned significant shares in. 4 years, the income from that investment had been one of the sources of his financial peace of mind. But John had never bothered to understand the intricacies of the business. Now it took on a whole new meaning. He picked up the phone and made a series of strategic calls. First, he contacted his lawyer, a trusted man who had been with him since his early years as an investor. João was direct. "I want to know all the details about how that particular concessionaire works. Who the managers are, what the service practices are, and I want a full report by the end of the day." His tone was calm, but there was a firmness that left no room for questioning. On the other end of the line, the lawyer simply replied, "Understood, Mr. João," before starting to mobilize his team. While waiting for the answers, João spent the morning reviewing contracts and planning his next steps. He knew that his position as an investor gave him the authority to intervene in the running of the business, but he wanted more than that. He wanted every person in that store to understand that actions have consequences. He wanted to teach a lesson that would be remembered not only by those who had treated him badly, but by everyone who had once underestimated someone because of their appearance. In the early afternoon, the information started coming in. The report detailed the store's chain of command: the general manager, who rarely appeared on site; the sales manager, who promoted a culture of aggressive competition among the salespeople, encouraging them to focus only on customers who appeared to have purchasing power; and the salespeople themselves, whose training seemed to be based more on targets than on respect for the customer. John, however, wasn't interested in excuses or explanations. He knew that the store's practices were not an isolated deviation, but a reflection of something much bigger. So he devised a plan that would require more than just money. He wanted to ensure that his message was clear and that no one else would ever experience the humiliation he had experienced. The next morning, João decided to go to the dealership himself. This time, however, he didn't wear his plain clothes. He arrived in a rental car, a luxury model that caught everyone's attention as soon as he parked it. Wearing an impeccable suit, he got out of the vehicle with a posture that exuded authority. As soon as he entered the showroom, the change in the salespeople's behavior was instantaneous. The same employees who had ignored him the day before now rushed up to greet him. Forced smiles and exaggerated greetings filled the air as each one tried to be the first to see him. João remained calm, but observed everything carefully. He wanted every detail of that moment to remain etched in their memories. After a few minutes, he asked to speak to the store's general manager. The expression on the sales assistant's face when he heard the request changed instantly. There was a mixture of nervousness and curiosity. It was unusual for someone to ask to speak directly to the manager, especially with such a firm tone. In a matter of minutes, the manager appeared, smiling and holding out his hand. "Sir, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our store. How can I help you today?" John shook the man's hand, but didn't smile back. In a calm voice, he replied, I believe you've heard of me. I'm João Silva, the majority investor in this network of car dealerships. I'm here today to deal with a very serious matter. The manager's smile immediately disappeared. He tried to say something, but João raised his hand, gently but firmly interrupting him. Before we go any further, I want you to call all your employees together. I want to talk to every single person who works here. Within minutes, the entire team was gathered in the showroom. The faces that once displayed confidence and arrogance were now marked by nervousness and anxiety. John looked at each of them before he began to speak. Yesterday, I walked into this store like any other customer. My appearance wasn't sophisticated and my car wasn't luxurious. You probably judged me on that alone. I was ignored, underestimated, and even ridiculed. But you made a mistake. You didn't just judge a customer. You judged the man who has the power to decide the future of each and every one of you in this company. The room fell absolutely silent. João could feel the weight of his words in the bewildered looks on the faces of the employees. He knew that this was only the beginning, but this was exactly what he wanted. The tension in the showroom was almost palpable. João, with his imposing posture, walked slowly among the assembled employees. His footsteps echoed through the silent space, while every eye followed his movements, mixing fear and discomfort. He knew he was in control of the situation, but more than that, he knew that this moment would be an unforgettable lesson not only for those present, but also for anyone who heard the story. After a few seconds of silence, John stopped in the center of the group. With a firm tone, but without raising his voice, he began. Throughout my life, I've learned to value people for who they are, not what they look like. I've learned that respect is the basis of any relationship, whether professional or personal. Yesterday, you showed that you don't share these values. Not only did you ignore a customer, but you disrespected someone who could have invested in this business. And that is unacceptable. The words cut like blades, and the discomfort on the faces of the employees was visible. Some looked at the floor, others fidgeted nervously, but no one dared interrupt him. John continued, "You didn't know who I was. You had no idea that the simple man who walked through that door had invested a good part of his life in businesses like this, believing that they stood for something greater. Quality, integrity, and, above all, respect for the customer. But what I saw yesterday was the opposite of that. I was ignored because it didn't seem worth it. So here's the reality. You didn't treat me as someone irrelevant, but as if I were invisible. And that, for any customer, is unforgivable." He paused strategically, letting his words sink in. The silence was interrupted only by the restrained breathing of those present. "Last night," John resumed, his tone even more serious, "I revisited everything I knew about this company. I discovered that this store's problems are not an isolated case. They reflect a culture that I, as the majority investor, refuse to tolerate. And that's why today I'm not just here to point out mistakes. I'm here to make changes." At that moment, John took an envelope of papers out of his pocket. He held it up for everyone to see. "This is the restructuring plan that will be implemented immediately. It includes not only changes to processes, but also to the team. I want you to know that what happened yesterday will have direct consequences for the future of this store and, above all, for you." The general manager, who until then had been silent, tried to intervene. "Mr. João, I understand your dissatisfaction, but I believe this may have been a misunderstanding." João raised his hand, interrupting him again. "It's not a misunderstanding, Mr. Manager. It's a pattern that is now coming to an end. From today, this store will be an example of how to treat customers with dignity and respect. But this will require changes that many of you may not be ready to face. He then began to list the changes. First, a full audit would be carried out to review sales and service practices. Next, the team would undergo intensive training, focusing on ethics and customer service. Finally, he announced that some people would no longer be part of the team. Unfortunately, João declared, looking directly at the sales manager and some salespeople, some attitudes are so ingrained that they can only be corrected by replacing those who perpetuate them. You, who were in charge of customer service yesterday, will be dismissed immediately. The faces of those dismissed turned pale. They tried to argue, but John stood his ground. He wasn't there to hear excuses, but to ensure that respect was restored. Understand one thing, he concluded. This is not revenge. I'm not here to humiliate you, but to show you that every action has a consequence. You had the opportunity to do the right thing and you failed. Now others will have that chance. He then turned to the remaining employees and said, for those of you who remain, this is a new opportunity. Work to rebuild the store's reputation and make sure that no one else feels the way I did yesterday. I'll be monitoring everything closely. And remember, respect is the minimum, not the maximum. With that, João began to head for the exit. But before he left, he made one last remark. I'm not the only customer you've underestimated, but I hope I'm the last. Learn to treat each person as if they were the most important person who has ever walked through these doors. Because, in the end, they might be. As he left, he felt a mixture of relief and accomplishment. He knew he had left a lasting impact, not just on that store, but on the lives of every person present. More than a lesson, he had planted a seed of change. As João walked out of the dealership, the silence that filled the showroom echoed like a reflection of the lessons he had taught that day. Every step he took was loaded with meaning, a reminder that true greatness lies not only in the ability to act, but in the courage to do so with principles and integrity. He didn't buy the company to flaunt power or to take revenge. He did it to show that respect is not a concession, but an obligation. Outside, João stopped for a moment, took a deep breath and looked up at the sky. He felt no anger, only the satisfaction of having done what was necessary. Deep down, it wasn't about the cars, the employees, or the store. It was about the dignity of every human being and the impact that small attitudes can have on someone's life. At that moment, he knew that his action had left an indelible mark. Days later, news of the unexpected purchase and drastic restructuring began to circulate. João's story spread, inspiring many to rethink the way they treat others. The dealership, now with a renewed and trained team, began to flourish. Customers returned, attracted by the new service philosophy, and João's name became associated with transformation and leadership with purpose. For João, the outcome was simple. He sold the company months later, not out of necessity, but because he knew his message had been delivered. The financial profit was just a bonus. The real value was in knowing that he had made a difference. And so John's story became a living reminder that appearances can be deceiving, but character always prevails. He proved that, even in the face of scorn, it is possible to act wisely and, above all, that respect should never be negotiated. Just for those of you who like a good story and watched it to the end, leave your comment below. I stayed until the end. And there's one more thing. Poor kid helps millionaire with flat tire. What happened next changed his life forever. Imagine being at your most difficult moment, with no money and no hope. And suddenly a simple choice changes everything. He was just a poor kid on an old bicycle, but what he did that day changed his life and that of a millionaire forever. You'll never believe what happened. That's the theme of the video I've pinned to your screen. Just click and watch. I'll see you there.